The world was reduced to a single crushing sound. It wasn't the distant thunder of artillery, nor the sporadic, insect-like chatter of machine guns from the streets above. This was deeper. It was a physical presence, a grinding, roaring tremor that moved through the very bones of the Reichstag, through the cold stone floor, and up into Leo's spine. It vibrated in his teeth, in the fillings his mother had paid too much for. It was the sound of something enormous, something alive, and made of iron, moving through the ruins of Berlin. Leo was pressed into a cavity of shattered brick, a pocket of darkness in the cellar. His heart wasn't just beating, it was trying to batter its way out of his ribcage. He clutched the Panzerfaust, his fingers numb and slick with cold sweat, against the cold steel of the trigger housing. The weapon was obscenely heavy, a dumb, green iron pipe that smelled of chemical promise and death. A week ago, this weight was a school satchel. A week ago, the only tremors came from the underground trains. The memory assaulted him, not as a thought, but as a full sensory flash. The sour smell of the school gymnasium turned muster hall, the panicked breath of 100 other boys and old men, the blinding glare of a political officer's polished boots. The man's voice, shrill and metallic, cutting through the fog. One boy, one Panzerfaust, one tank. That is the mathematics of victory. You are not children. You are Germany's final argument. The heavy, clumsy tube slammed into Leo's chest, knocking the air from him. An old man with eyes like wet stones, Emmeler, had grabbed his shoulder, his grip like brittle bird bones. The sight. Just use the sight, boy. Don't think. Leo blinked, and the cellar swam back into focus. Emmeler was still here, 3 meters away, slumped in a grotesque parody of rest against a fallen beam. Not from a bullet. One of the earth-shattering concussions that had shaken the city for days had simply switched him off. A tiny trickle of blood from his ear was now a dark, intricate map on his neck. His mouth was open, as if mid-sentence. The grinding roar outside shifted pitch. It was closer. It was turning. Debris sifted from the ceiling in a continuous, whispering rain. A web of cracks in the far wall lengthened with an audible snap. Action. He had to move. The instruction was a cold, hard knot in his gut. He was the last defender of this hole. It was absurd. It was the only truth he had left. He scrambled from his hiding place, the Panzerfaust scraping against brick. His movements were frantic, animal. He needed a firing position, a vantage point. The cellar was a landscape of defeat. Shattered furniture from the chambers above, waterlogged files spilling like entrails, a portrait of the Führer ripped nearly in half by a falling chunk of masonry. Leo's eyes scanned, not seeing the symbols, seeing only angles, cover, lines of sight. He stumbled towards the source of the only light, a vertical slit, where a supply hatch had been partially torn from its hinges. It was just wide enough to push the muzzle of the Panzerfaust through. As he neared, the monstrous sound outside crystallized into components. The shrieking protest of tortured steel, the basso profundo of a diesel engine at full roar, the rhythmic, earth-pulverizing clank-groan clank of tracks crushing stone, brick, and bone. He dropped to his knees before the slit, the cold from the stones seeping through his thin trousers. He forced the heavy tube up, leveling it. The world outside was a blur of smoke and ruin. He pressed his eye to the crude, stamped metal sight, and he saw it. Not all of it. That was impossible. His brain, reeling, tried to process fragments. a moving cliff of dark green steel so close the vision in his sight swam with its immensity. A massive, independent road wheel, taller than he was, caked with black earth and something else. Darker, redder. The lower hull of a behemoth, pocked and scarred by shrapnel that looked like acne on a giant. This was no ordinary tank. This was the thing from the whispered warnings, the monster from the Soviet arsenal, the IS-2, Stalin's monster. It was rolling past his slit, a fortress on tracks, its long, overhanging gun barrel sweeping the ruins ahead like a blind man's cane. He could see the welds on its armor plates, thick as a man's fingers. His Panzerfaust, the armor fist, suddenly felt like a child's toy, a ridiculous spitball aimed at a battleship. A wave of pure, primal terror turned his bowels to water. This wasn't a target. This was a force of nature. The mathematical equation from the gymnasium, one boy, one weapon, one tank, shattered into a million useless pieces. His finger, frozen on the trigger, began to cramp. A single thought screamed in his head, drowning out the roar. If I fire, it will know I am here. The moment stretched, elastic, and unbearable. The rear of the colossal machine filled his sight, the huge exhaust grills belching dirty smoke. The perfect shot, point-blank range, the kill zone in the training diagram. He could not move. A new sound cut through the diesel growl. Human voices. Sharp, clear commands in a language that was all hard edges and purpose. Soviet infantry, dismounted, moving alongside their metal god. He saw their boots, their mud-spattered telegrikas, the snub-nosed muzzle of a PPSH submachine gun swinging past the slit. They were talking, their tones not of fear, but of grim, weary determination. One even laughed, a short, harsh bark that was more terrifying than any scream. Leo's breath hitched, a sob trapped in his throat. These were not faceless demons. They were men, tired, dirty men, following their monster through hell, just as he was hiding from it, in his. The IS-2's engine note changed again. It wasn't moving past. It was slowing, stopping. The great iron beast was settling its weight directly opposite his hiding place, just meters away, separated by a few feet of crumbling brick and his own frail, trembling life. The decision, vast and absolute, crashed down upon him in the sudden, relative silence. It was no longer a question of how. It was the terrifying question of if. And in that moment, Leo, the boy from Charlottenburg, the failed algebra student, the son, knew with chilling certainty that he was completely, utterly alone. The final argument of Germany was silent, hiding in a hole, and did not know what to say. Silence did not return. It was replaced by something worse, the idle grumble of the sleeping giant. The IS-2 had not stopped for a tactical assessment. It had stopped to breathe. A deep mechanical respiration, the diesel engine settling into a low, rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum that pulsed through the stone and into Leo's marrow. This was not the sound of a machine resting. It was the sound of a predator momentarily pausing, its hot metallic heart still pounding, ready to explode back into motion. The infantry voices had moved off, scattering into the surrounding rubble. They were clearing buildings, their shouts now muffled and echoic. But the monster remained. It was Leo's neighbor. Paralysis held him for a long minute, his eye still glued to the sight, the Panzerfaust, a leaden weight, pulling his arms down. The view was static now, a detailed study of the beast's flank. He saw the texture of the cast steel, not smooth but rough, like elephant skin. He saw the deep, shadowed recesses of the bolted-on additional armor plates, He saw a splash of white paint, a crude Soviet slogan almost worn away. This was not an abstract weapon from a propaganda leaflet. It was a specific, individual creature with scars and markings. It had a history. It had killed before. A new, more insidious terror began to replace the initial shock, the terror of proximity. He could smell it now, a cocktail of hot engine oil, diesel exhaust, and the sharp, coppery scent of expended cordite that clung to its hide. It was the smell of the front, of a world that had been marching toward him for years and was now sitting 6 meters away. Slowly, muscles screaming in protest, he lowered the Panzerfaust. The metal tube scraped against the brick with a sound that seemed deafening, though it was lost under the engine's idle. He had to see more. He had to understand what he was facing. He needed a better angle. Crawling backward like a crab, he retreated from the slit. His body felt alien, disconnected. He moved past Emmler's corpse without a glance. The old man was now just another piece of the cellar's furniture, his relevance erased by the new, living occupant outside. Leo's mind was a hyper-focused machine, driven by a desperate, rodent-like cunning. Survival was no longer a philosophical concept. It was a series of immediate, physical calculations. Against the far wall was a collapsed stack of wooden crates, likely once containing stationary or bureaucratic forms. They led up towards a higher, narrower opening, a broken air duct or a shell hole. It was a climb. It was exposure. The engine thrummed, a constant reminder of the giant's presence. It was a sound that demanded a response, fight or flight. But flight was impossible. The cellar was his universe, so his mind, traitorously, turned to fight. He set the Panzerfaust down carefully, with a reverence one gives a primed bomb, and began to climb. The crates groaned and shifted under his weight. Splinters dug into his palms. Every sound he made was a personal betrayal. He reached the higher opening, a jagged tear in the Reichstag's thick wall, just wide enough to wedge his shoulders through. The world outside was a panoramic vision of hell, framed by shattered brick. The sky was a poisonous yellow-gray from the countless fires. The grand buildings he remembered from school trips were now skeletal facades, their innards spilling out. And directly below him, so close he felt he could spit on it, was the IS-2. From this vantage point, its scale was comprehended in a way the slit view had denied. It was monstrously, overwhelmingly huge. Its turret, broad and imposing as a small bunker, was turned slightly away from him. The long, overhanging barrel of the 122mm gun pointed like an accusatory finger down the Wilhelmstrasse. He could see the complex cast texture of the mantlet, the subtle unevenness of the welded seams where the armor plates met. He could see the periscopic lenses of the commander's cup glinting dully. Was someone looking out right now? Could they sense his stare? His training, a pathetic 2 hours in a bomb-cratered park, flooded back in a useless jumble. Emahler's raspy voice: "The side armor, behind the tracks, is thinner. The rear, near the engine grills, is best. 1 shot. You only get 1. Leo's eyes began to trace the anatomy of the giant, searching for its Achilles heel. The massive, sloped side armor looked impenetrable. The tracks were protected by long, armored skirts, but one was partially mangled, bent upward from some past encounter. Behind it, he glimpsed the vulnerable road wheels and the lower hull. A possible shot. The rear was better, but from here he only saw the back of the turret and the heavily sloped engine deck. The grills were there, but at a steep angle. A movement. A hatch on the turret squealed open. Leo flinched, pressing himself back into the shadows of the hole, his blood turning to ice. A Soviet tanker emerged. Not a mythical Bolshevik beast, but a young man, perhaps in his 20s. His face was smeared with grime and sweat, his black tanker's helmet pushed back. He stretched, rolling his shoulders, and lit a cigarette. The match flared, illuminating a tired, ordinary face. He took a long drag, exhaling smoke that was swallowed by the diesel fumes. He looked out over the ruins, his expression unreadable, not triumphant, not vengeful, just weary to the bone. Then he did something inexplicable. He pulled a small, battered harmonica from his pocket. He wiped it on his overalls, put it to his lips, and began to play. The notes were faint, thin, and hauntingly out of place. A slow, sad folk tune that wavered in the toxic air. The dissonance was catastrophic for Leo's mind. This was the enemy, the invader in the heart of his city, inside the steel beast that could pulverize him in an instant. And he was playing a lonely, beautiful melody. The man's comrades called out from the rubble. A joke was shouted. The tanker smiled briefly, a flash of white in his dirty face, and shouted a reply. He took another puff of his cigarette, finished the mournful tune, and dropped back inside the hatch. It closed with a solid metallic clunk. Leo remained frozen, his cheek against the cold brick. The giant continued to thrum. But it was no longer just a monster. It was a conveyance, a metal shell containing men. Men who smoked, who joked, who felt a need for music amidst the carnage. This fundamental human truth dismantled the last of the propaganda walls in his mind. He wasn't facing an impersonal force of destruction. He was facing a crew. 4 or 5 men just like Emmeler, just like the boys from his school. They were inside that steel fortress, and he was outside with his one pathetic tube of high explosives. The tactical problem, where to aim, was now drowned in a tidal wave of a moral one. To fire was not to attack a machine, it was to burn, shatter, and eviscerate those specific men inside that specific steel box. He saw the harmonica player's tired face. He heard the ghost of the melody. The engine's rhythm changed again. It coughed, revved slightly. A shout from outside. The infantry were returning. The giant was stirring. Leo scrambled down from the crates, his hands slick with sweat. He landed awkwardly, his ankle twisting with a jolt of pain. He ignored it. He lunged for the Panzerfaust, his earlier paralysis shattered by a new, more urgent panic. The time for observation was over. The beast was awakening, and it would either roll away, granting him a reprieve, or it would turn its attention to the Reichstag itself. He had to be ready. He had to decide. Now. The cold weight of the weapon was back in his hands, but it felt different. It was no longer just a tool. It was a question, and the answer, coiled in his gut, was a formless, terrifying dread. He crawled back to the firing slit, the giant's shadow falling directly across his face. The giant was not leaving. It was turning. The deep-throated engine revved, not with the smooth purpose of movement, but in short, grinding bursts. The sound was no longer a background pulse. It was a directed physical assault. Each metallic snarl was accompanied by the shriek of steel tracks fighting for purchase on the rubble-strewn cobblestones. The entire structure of the cellar groaned in response. A fresh cascade of dust and fine plaster snowed down from the ceiling, powdering Leo's hair and shoulders as he knelt at the slit. He had the Panzerfaust up, shouldered, his right eye squeezed shut, the left pressed hard against the cold rim of the sight. The world was reduced to a circular frame of stamped metal, containing a fragment of apocalyptic reality. Through the sight, the universe was the side of the IS-2. But it was no longer a static cliff face. It was a living wall in motion. The tank was pivoting on its left track, its massive bulk rotating with a terrifying geological slowness towards the Reichstag's main entrance, towards his position. It was bringing its frontal armor, the thickest, most impenetrable part of its being, to bear. This wasn't a passing monster. It was preparing to engage. A new sound cut through the diesel roar. The high-pitched electric whine of a turret traverse motor. Leo's heart stopped. He watched, frozen in his optical prison, as the enormous gun barrel, which had been pointing down the street, began to swing in a slow, deliberate arc. It was like watching the minute hand of a doomsday clock. It was traversing towards his general direction. They weren't aiming at him specifically. They couldn't know he was here. But they were aiming at his building. The cellar was about to become part of the battlefield. Thought evaporated. The intellectual terror, the moral quagmire, was burned away by the pure, white-hot fuel of survival instinct. The equations of the gymnasium rushed back, not as propaganda, but as brutal, simple arithmetic. Target, front armor. Slope, approximately 60 degrees. Estimated thickness, over 120 millimeters of cast steel. Panzerfaust, 100 penetration. At this angle, 0. Chance of kill, 0. His mind, shockingly clear, rejected the frontal shot. It was suicide. A flash on the armor, a shower of sparks, and the certain immediate retaliation of the main gun, or the coaxial machine gun that now he could see clearly, its dark eye socket trained forward. Target, the turret, the rounded mantletless front of the IS-2's turret. Thick, curved. A shot could deflect. Chance of kill low. Chance of disabling the gun? Maybe. The barrel continued its sweep. It was now pointing almost directly at a wing of the building 30 meters to his left. They had a target. Target. The exposed lower side hull, behind the damaged skirt. Visible now as the tank turned. Angle, nearly flat. Range, less than 30 meters. A fuel tank or ammunition rack could be behind that plate. Penetration, high. Chance of kill, the highest. This was it. The mathematical solution. The vulnerable spot. Emoller's ghost whispered in his ear, "There. That is your shot." Leo's finger found the trigger. It was smooth, cold. His breathing hitched. He began the drill. He aligned the sight picture, the tip of the front sight post, covering the spot just behind the last road wheel, under the bent armor skirt. He compensated for the giant's slow pivot, leading it slightly. The target filled the sight. It was perfect. Textbook. His body was a coiled spring of tension. Every muscle, every sinew was locked in the act of aiming. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eye. He blinked it away. And in that millisecond of blurred vision, the calculation broke. It wasn't a thought. It was an image. The face of the tanker with the harmonica, superimposed on the green steel plate in his sight. Not as a ghost, but as a physical reality. To pull the trigger was not to hit a spot. It was to direct a focused jet of molten copper and hellfire into that space. The space where that man, and others like him, were sitting. He was not shooting at a fuel tank. He was shooting into a room. The tactical clarity shattered into a kaleidoscope of horrifying specifics. The shaped charge jet would punch through the steel, a superheated spear of destruction. It would fill the fighting compartment with spalling, shards of red-hot metal screaming in every direction. It would ignite fuel, ammunition, flesh. The men inside would not just die. They would be cooked, shredded, obliterated in a microsecond of unimaginable violence. The harmonica in the man's pocket would melt. The cigarette butts in the ashtray would vaporize. The gun barrel stopped its traverse. It had found its target. The tank itself halted its turn, settling into a firing position. The engine's roar dropped to a menacing idle. They were ready. Leo's finger, poised on the trigger, began to tremble violently. A violent, full-body tremor that shook the entire Panzerfaust. The sight picture blurred into a greenish smear. He was no longer a soldier calculating a shot. He was a boy about to commit an act of intimate, industrialized murder. A new variable entered the equation, one never covered in training: the cost to the shooter. Could he, Leo Becker, who still dreamed of algebra tests and summer lakes, pull this trigger and then continue to exist? Or would the act split him in two, leaving the hollowed-out shell of a boy in this cellar, forever haunted by a scream of metal and a fragment of a folk tune? The IS-2 fired. The world dissolved into sound and fury. It was not the sharp crack of a smaller gun. It was a cataclysmic boom that punched the air from Leo's lungs. The flash from the muzzle was a sun blooming in the ruins. The concussion hit the cellar like a physical fist. The wall around his slit seemed to bulge inward. A storm of brick dust, splinters, and deafening noise engulfed him. He was thrown backward, the Panzerfaust wrenching from his grasp, clattering across the floor. He landed on his back, the breath knocked out of him, his ears ringing with a high-pitched, eternal whine. The ceiling rained heavy chunks of plaster and stone. The giant had spoken. Its question, a 122mm high-explosive shell, was now exploding into the heart of the Reichstag. The reply was due, and Leo lay on the floor of the shaking cellar, weaponless, deafened, his entire body screaming in protest, the perfect shot forgotten, replaced by the raw, animal imperative to survive the next 10 seconds. The calculus was over. Now there was only the storm. Silence did not return. It was obliterated. The ringing in Leo's ears was a white noise wall, a psychic scar torn across his senses. Beneath it, reality reassembled itself in fragments of pure chaotic sensation. He was on his back. The cold of the stone floor seared through his tunic. His mouth was full of the taste of pulverized brick and ancient plaster, dry, choking, and suffocatingly thick. A heavy, gritty dust filled the air, visible as a swirling, malevolent fog in the shafts of fractured light, now piercing the cellar from new wounds in the ceiling. He couldn't hear the diesel grumble, couldn't hear the shouts. He was trapped in a silent film of devastation, but his body felt every vibration. A deep, visceral trembling began in his core, a seismic aftershock of the blast that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with physics. His organs felt rearranged. He tried to breathe and coughed violently, expelling a cloud of dust. The act of coughing sent sharp jabs of pain through his ribs. Vision returned in stuttering snapshots. The cellar was transformed. Where before there had been oppressive order in the decay, now there was active ruination. A massive support beam, once horizontal, now sagged at a drunken angle, splintered in its middle. The portrait of the Emperor was gone, buried under a mound of debris. The desk with the family photograph had vanished. Emmler's body was partially concealed under a cascade of broken masonry. Only a boot and the cuff of a trouser's leg were visible. And the light. It was wrong. A new, jagged gash had been torn in the far wall, letting in the ghastly, yellow-gray daylight of Berlin's apocalypse. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in frantic, panicked swirls. The first sound to penetrate the ringing was a low, grinding roar. It was the IS-2's engine, but amplified, angrier. They were moving again. Not away. They were repositioning. The shot had been an opening statement. Now they were moving in for the interrogation. A raw, animal survival instinct, older than any nation or ideology, took over. Leo scrambled, not to his feet, but on all fours, a desperate crab scuttle across the treacherous floor. His objective was not the Panzerfaust. His objective was cover. The world had narrowed to a single imperative: get behind something solid before the next world-ending boom arrived. He flung himself behind the collapsed stack of crates he had climbed earlier. They were shattered now, but the dense tangle of wood and the surviving section of wall offered a fragile promise of shelter. He curled into a fetal position, his arms wrapped around his head, his face pressed into the crook of his elbow. He was a child, hiding from a thunderstorm that had decided to personally hunt him. The engine roar grew closer. The grinding of tracks was directly overhead now. The giant was parking on their roof. The vibration was immense, dislodging a new rain of debris. Small stones pattered down on the broken wood around him. The sheer weight of the machine above was an existential threat. The cellar ceiling, already wounded, could collapse at any moment and bury him alive. A trivial footnote to the tank's passage. Then, a new sound. Metallic, rhythmic, and horrifyingly close. Clang, clang, clang. It was the sound of solid steel striking solid stone. Methodical, purposeful. Leo dared to lift his head. Through a gap in the wreckage of the crates, he had a slivered view of the new gash in the wall. It was no longer just a hole. Framed within it, backlit by the fires of the city, was the lower hull and the nearest track of the IS-2. It was right there. So close he could see the individual track links, each one the size of a dinner plate, caked with a paste of mud, pulverized brick, and other unidentifiable dark matter. The sielang was the sound of those links biting and tearing at the foundation of the Reichstag itself as the tank settled its weight. But that wasn't the source of the rhythmic noise. His eyes, adjusting to the dust and gloom, tracked upward. A Soviet infantryman was standing just outside the breach. He was turned partially away, his focus on the tank. In his hands was a long, heavy sledgehammer. He was using it to beat against a stubborn, twisted piece of reinforcement bar that protruded from the rubble, clearing a path or marking a spot. Clang, clang, clang. Each strike was a physical blow to Leo's sanity. This was no longer a distant war. This was a man with a tool, doing a job, 6 meters from where Leo hid. The man's back was turned. He was vulnerable. A grenade, a rifle shot, or the Panzerfaust, whose shape Leo now glimpsed, half buried under dust near his original firing position. A furnace door slammed open in Leo's chest. The cold, dissociated terror was blasted away by a sudden, overwhelming surge of pure, undiluted fury. It was hot, blinding, and righteous. This was his city. This was his hiding place, his tomb. This soldier, this invader with his hammer, was violating the last square meter of Leo's world. The moral calculus of minutes ago, the harmonica player, the humanity inside the steel box, evaporated in the heat of this new, personal violation. The image of the tanker was replaced by the swinging sledgehammer. The sad folk tune was drowned out by the clang of steel on steel. This was the enemy. Simple, clear, and in reach. The fury gave him strength, a toxic electric energy. His pain, his deafness, his trembling were burned away. His mind constructed a new, brutal equation. Soldier. Back-turned. Panzerfaust. One shot. Not at the invincible giant, but at its attendant. A bite-back. A statement. He would not die cowering in a hole. He would take one of them with him. He began to move, uncurling from his fetal position. His movements were no longer frantic, but deliberate, fueled by a single-minded hate. He kept his eyes locked on the soldier's back, on the rising and falling hammer. He planned his route, a low crawl to the weapon, a quick clearing of the dust, a roll to a new position with a clearer line of sight through the breach. He would aim for the center of mass. At this range, he couldn't miss. The high-explosive anti-tank warhead would do catastrophic things to a human body. It would be a massacre. It would be justice. His hand reached the cold metal of the Panzerfaust tube. His fingers closed around it, gripping with a new, fierce certainty. This was his purpose. This was the final argument. The soldier outside stopped hammering. He lowered the sledgehammer, leaning on it briefly, wiping his brow with his sleeve. He turned his head, just slightly, and called out to someone near the tank. He was young, younger than Leo had thought. He had a narrow, sharp face, red from exertion. And in that moment, as Leo watched the young soldier take a breath, as he saw the simple human fatigue in the slump of his shoulders, the furnace of his fury spluttered. The image of a catastrophic kill was replaced by a horrifyingly specific one. This specific boy, his body torn apart by the shaped charge meant for a tank's armor. The clang of the hammer still echoed in Leo's bones, but now it echoed alongside the ghost of a harmonica's tune. The two sounds, one of brute force, one of melancholy beauty, collided in his soul. They were the same. They were both just boys in a hell not of their making. He held the weapon meant for a giant, aimed now at a boy with a hammer. And the hatred, so bright and certain a moment before, curdled into a sick, shameful nausea. He was not a soldier delivering justice. He was a terrified animal about to commit a spectacular and utterly pointless murder. The trigger finger that had trembled with fear now trembled with a different, more awful tension. The tension of a choice between two kinds of self-destruction. The weapon in his hands was no longer a tool. It was an accusation. Its weight, which had been a promise of power, was now the anchor of a crime not yet committed. Leo's knuckles were white around the cold steel tube, but the fury that had fueled his grip had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, shaking chill. The young soldier with the sledgehammer had turned fully now, shouting something up at the tank commander, his voice muffled, but his profile clear in the dusty light from the breach. He was just a silhouette doing a job. Leo lowered the Panzerfaust. He didn't set it down. He simply let its muzzle dip towards the rubble-strewn floor, as if too exhausted to maintain the aim. The movement felt like a physical defeat, a surrender of the last shred of purposeful action. He slumped back against the shattered crates, the rough wood biting into his spine. The cacophony of war, the idling monster above, the distant fires, the sporadic small arms fire, receded into a dull roar, a soundtrack to the vacuum opening inside him. His eyes, unfocused, drifted away from the breach, away from the living enemy, and settled on the only other presence in the cellar that was not a threat. Emmeler's boot. It protruded, absurdly tidy, from beneath the hill of debris that had entombed the rest of him. The leather was scuffed, but once well polished. It was a civilian boot, not a military one. A teacher's boot, a clerk's boot, the boot of a man who should have been worrying about pension payments, not defending the Reichstag with a teenage stranger. A memory, not a flash of panic or instruction, but a quiet, mundane fragment, surfaced with painful clarity. It was from their first hour in this cellar, before the world had narrowed to the gaze of a gun sight. Emmeler had been rummaging in his pack, his hands trembling with a gentle, constant palsy. He'd pulled out not ammunition, but a small wax paper-wrapped package. Cheese, hard, dry, and precious. He'd broken a piece off with surprising care and offered it to Leo without a word. His eyes in that moment held no fanaticism, no hate, just a deep, weary embarrassment. They ate in silence, the old man's gaze fixed on the far wall, seeing nothing. He had then carefully rewrapped the remnant and placed it back in his pack, patting it once. A ritual, a connection to a normalcy that was already a ghost. Leo had thought him weak then. Now he understood that quiet embarrassment was the last defense of a stolen humanity. A compulsion seized him. He had to move. Not to fight, not to hide, but to see. He needed to see the man, not the corpse. Carefully, silently, he crept out from behind his cover, leaving the Panzerfaust leaning against the broken wood. He crawled on his hands and knees across the uneven floor, avoiding the loose stone that might betray him with a scrape. The Soviet soldier was still visible, now smoking a cigarette, his back to the cellar again. But Leo paid him no mind. His entire world was the pile of rubble and that single, patient boot. He reached it. He stopped. The dust here was thick, settled. With a reverence that felt both alien and utterly necessary, he began to clear the smaller stones and chunks of plaster away from around Emmeler's leg. It was slow work, each piece lifted and set aside with deliberate care. The physical action was a meditation, a focus that pushed back the paralyzing fear and moral chaos. He uncovered the leg, the trousers, the old man's hip. He worked his way up, his breath catching in his throat. Finally, he cleared the debris from Emmeler's chest and face. Death had not softened his features. It had simplified them. The lines of worry, of fear, of quiet humiliation were gone, smoothed into a vacant stillness. The trickle of blood from his ear was a dark, dry river on his parchment skin. But in his left hand, crushed against his chest by the fallen stones, was something. A small oilcloth pouch. Gently, Leo pried the cold, stiff fingers open. He slid the pouch out. His own hands were trembling violently now, but with a different tension. He untied the crude knot. Inside was no medal, no party badge, no military map. There was a single tarnished iron cross from a previous, greater war. And a letter. The paper was cheap and soft from repeated handling. It was covered in a precise looping cursive, a woman's hand. Leo didn't need to read the salutation to know. It was from Emmeler's granddaughter. He could smell a faint trace of lavender. Or perhaps it was his imagination weaving a world that had to have existed. He didn't read it word for word. His eyes, blurred with unshed tears and dust, skimmed over the lines, capturing fragments that hit him with the force of physical blows. Opa, the kitten you found in the shed has grown so fat she can barely chase a string. Mutti says the apples in the orchard are small this year, but so sweet. We saved a jar of jam for you. I drew a picture of you in your garden. I gave you a bigger hat. Please come home soon. The cherry tree misses your pruning. The words were mundane. They were about fat cats and jam and a cherry tree. They were about a life that was continuing, somewhere beyond this hell. A life of small, tender concerns. A life Emaller was supposed to return to. A life he had clutched against his heart as the world fell on top of him. Leo sat back on his heels, the letter held loosely in his grimy fingers. He looked from the gentle, ordinary words to the monstrous green tube leaning against the crates. He looked at the breach in the wall where the Soviet boy finished his cigarette and ground it under his heel. A profound, tectonic shift occurred within him. It was not an epiphany of courage or a surge of renewed hate. It was a collapse of the fiction he had been told. He was not Germany's final argument. Emaller had not been a warrior. They were both sacrifices, expendable tokens in a game played by madmen who were nowhere near this cellar. Their deaths would not turn the tide. They would not be remembered. They would only cause a ripple of grief in a small, distant place. A granddaughter wondering why Opa never came to prune the cherry tree again. The geometry of his entire existence reoriented. The central point was no longer the Reichstag, the Panzerfaust, or the enemy tank. The central points were now two fixed stars in a different, sane universe. His mother's voice saying, "Come home," and a little girl's drawing of a man in a big hat under a cherry tree. To fire the Panzerfaust was to betray both. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him, the first that felt like his own in hours. The choice, which had been a searing conflict between duty and fear, was gone. Replacing it was something colder, clearer, and infinitely more difficult. A vow of silence, a refusal to participate any further. He carefully, meticulously, folded the letter along its worn creases. He placed it back in the oilcloth pouch, nestled it back into Emler's stiffened hand, and closed the fingers over it as best he could. It was a futile gesture, but it was the only honorable action left to him in this place. He did not cover the old man's face. Let the indifferent daylight from the breach fall on it. Let the war see what it had done. Leo crawled back to his position, not as a defender, but as a witness. He picked up the Panzerfaust, not to aim it, but to move it. He dragged it with him, the heavy tube scraping a faint line in the dust, a final mark. He stowed it deep in the shadows behind the most solid remaining section of wall, far from any firing port. He shoved it away, pushing it with his foot, until it clunked dully against the stone and was swallowed by darkness. He was disarming himself, not from the enemy, but from the madness. Above him, the IS-2's engine revved, a deep, impatient growl. The giant was growing restless. The next phase was coming. But Leo's war, the one they had drafted him into, was over. He found a shallow depression in the floor, curled his body into it, and pressed his forehead against the cool, ancient stone. He closed his eyes, not to hide, but to finally see. He saw a kitchen table. He saw a bicycle leaning against a fence. He saw a cherry tree in bloom. The geometry was simple now. He was just a point, waiting for the storm to pass. The decision was not a moment. It was a landscape. Leo lay in the shallow depression, his body a map of aches and tremors, but his mind was preternaturally still. The chaos had not ended. It had simply been moved outside the borders of his self. The engine's growl, the shouts of soldiers, the crump of distant shells, these were weather. He was in the eye of a hurricane of his own making, a small circle of silence purchased at the cost of everything he'd been told he was supposed to be. But the storm was intensifying. The IS-2 above him roared, not with the idle thrum of before, but with a fierce, mechanical urgency. The sound of the tracks changed from a slow grind to a violent, tearing screech. They were no longer adjusting. They were attempting to break free. The giant was stuck. Leo understood without seeing. The combination of the shell-blasted terrain, the rubble of the Reichstag's foundation, and the tank's own colossal weight had mired it. One of its tracks was spinning, churning a fountain of pulverized stone and dirt into the air. The sound, a high-pitched, tortured shriek of metal on stone. The other track clanked, gripped, and held. The beast was trapped, its mobility, its primary defense, gone. It was now a stationary fortress, an immobilized god. This changed everything, for the enemy and for him. The Soviet infantry's mood shifted instantly. The casual tension snapped into sharp, barked commands. The young soldier with the sledgehammer dropped it, snatched up his submachine gun, and took cover behind a chunk of masonry, his eyes scanning the surrounding ruins with new, professional dread. A stationary tank was a magnet for every remaining anti-tank weapon in the area. They were vulnerable. They knew it. Inside the cellar, the universe was coming apart. The violent track spin was directly overhead. The vibration was no longer a tremor. It was a continuous, juddering quake. The ceiling, already critically wounded, began to shed not dust, but solid pieces. A hail of fist-sized stones rained down. A large slab of plaster detached and exploded on the floor where Leo had first taken cover. The support beam groaned a long, agonized note of protest. The very air in the cellar thickened with a new, choking cloud of particulate matter. Leo was forced to move. The depression was now a death trap. He scrambled, crawling on his belly like a worm, away from the cascading debris. His haven was dissolving around him. He had chosen not to fight, but the war had decided to bury him alive anyway. He found momentary shelter where the old desk had been, now just a mound of splinters pressed against a stout section of foundation wall. He pressed his back against the cold stone, drawing his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible. Through the swirling dust, he could see the breach. The view was a diorama of panic. The infantrymen were firing now, short, controlled bursts into the surrounding ruins, keeping heads down. One gestured frantically at the tank's immobilized track. And then he saw the commander. The hatch flew open again, and the tanker, not the harmonica player, but an older man with a leather helmet and a furious, soot-streaked face, emerged halfway. He was shouting, screaming orders at the infantry, pointing wildly at the track. He was exposed, terrified, a king whose throne was mired in mud. Here was the ultimate, unthinkable opportunity. It presented itself to Leo with crystalline, horrific clarity. The giant was crippled. Its master was exposed, vulnerable, just beyond the breach. The Panzerfaust, stowed in the shadows, was a mere 10-second crawl away. He could retrieve it, scramble to the breach, rest the tube on the rubble, and fire. At this range, against a stationary target, at the exposed upper hull or the open hatch, it was a guaranteed kill. He wouldn't just wound the beast, he would slay it. He would become a legend in a story no one would live to tell. He would validate every sacrifice, every piece of propaganda, every dead man in a gray uniform. He could, with one finger's twitch, change the microscopic calculus of this tiny corner of the war. The temptation was a physical force, a siren song made of steel and fire. It flooded the silent landscape of his decision with a roaring tide of possibility. His muscles twitched, coiled. His eyes darted to the darkness where the weapon lay. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. This was it. The final test. All his moral certainty, his vow of silence, his communion with Mahler's ghost, it all teetered on the brink of being swept away by the primal, thrilling lure of effect, of mattering. He saw it all in a flash, the blast, the fireball erupting from the hatch, the monstrous silhouette of the IS-2 becoming a funeral pyre, the cheering of German ghosts, his mother's face not welcoming a son but mourning a hero. He almost moved. His body leaned forward, weight shifting onto his hands. But then his gaze locked on the tank commander's face. Not as a target, but as a face. The man wasn't a demon. He was a commander whose vehicle was stuck, whose men were in danger, whose own life was hanging by a thread. His expression was not one of cruel triumph, but of desperate, professional fear. He was trying to save his crew. He was responsible for the men inside that steel box. And in that face, Leo did not see an enemy to be destroyed. He saw a reflection. He saw Mahler, responsible for a boy he didn't know. He saw himself, responsible for nothing and no one, and now, for everything. To fire now would not be an act of defense. It would be an act of assassination. It would be taking advantage of a moment of mechanical misfortune to commit an act of supreme violence. It would be choosing to be a murderer when he was no longer a soldier. The roaring tide of temptation crested, broke, and drained away, leaving behind the barren, solid rock of his earlier resolve. It was harder now, infinitely harder. Because the opportunity was real, and he was consciously, deliberately rejecting it. He did not crawl for the Panzerfaust. Instead, he watched. He bore witness. He watched the commander duck back inside, the hatch slamming shut. He watched the infantry redouble their efforts, one brave soldier darting forward through sporadic gunfire to jam a broken beam under the spinning track. He watched the immense machine rock as the driver gunned the engine in reverse, the scream of the track reaching a fever pitch. And then, with a sound like the earth tearing, the track bit. The giant lurched backward. It was free. The decision was made, not in the quiet after the letter, but in the screaming maelstrom of a perfect chance. He had chosen his silence. He had chosen to be a noun, a boy, a survivor, rather than a verb, a killer, a destroyer. The IS-2, having extricated itself, did not advance. It began to reverse, slowly, carefully, back the way it had come. It was leaving. The engagement was over. The monster was turning its back on him. Leo remained motionless, his body trembling not with fear or excitement, but with the sheer, exhausting cost of the choice now cemented in his soul. He had passed through the fire and had not been burned. He had been annealed into something else, something that would never fit in a uniform again. the dark shape of the Panzerfaust in the shadows, was now just a piece of debris, a relic of a person he had decided not to become. The storm, at last, was beginning to roll away. The retreat of the giant was not a quiet affair. It was an avalanche in reverse. Having torn itself free from the grasping rubble, the IS-2 moved with a new, deliberate caution that was, in its own way, more terrifying than its aggressive advance. It was a wounded predator, aware of its vulnerability, its massive bulk now a liability to be extracted from the kill zone. The engine's roar was subdued, a deep, grumbling complaint as the driver expertly worked the clutch and brakes, navigating the tank backwards with surprising grace for something so immense. From his refuge, Leo watched the spectacle through the widening frame of the breach. The tank was no longer a monolithic, impersonal force. Its movement revealed it as a complex, fragile machine of war. He saw the commander's hatch open again, just a crack, the barrel of a submachine gun protruding alongside the commander's periscopic binoculars as he scanned for threats. He saw the infantry, no longer advancing but forming a protective, scrambling cordon around their retreating steel charge. They moved with disciplined urgency, covering angles, firing occasional suppressing bursts into windows and shell holes. They were shepherds guiding a wounded, ironclad sheep. The sound was a symphony of withdrawal. The clanking, grinding tracks now moved in a slower, more purposeful rhythm. The shriek of tortured steel was gone, replaced by the crunch of debris being flattened under its own weight for a second time. The shouted commands of the Soviet soldiers were sharper, clipped, devoid of the earlier casual tension. This was a military operation under duress. And then the shadow passed. The most profound change was not in sound, but in light. For what felt like an eternity, the cellar had been plunged into a twilight dominated by the tank's oppressive silhouette, blocking the scant daylight from the breach. Now, as the IS-2 reversed past the opening, the shadow slid across the floor like a departing eclipse. The ghastly yellow-gray light of the burning city flooded in, weak and poisoned, but unobstructed. It illuminated the devastation in the cellar with a cruel new clarity. It fell on Mahler's uncovered face, on the letter still clutched in his hand, on the deep score in the dust where Leo had dragged the Panzerfaust into oblivion. The light was a revelation. It did not bring hope. It brought truth. With the shadow gone, the cellar was revealed not as a fortress, but as a tomb in progress. The scale of the destruction from the single 122mm shell was absolute. What had seemed like random chaos now showed its logic. A direct line of force from the impact point outside, through the wall, across the space where Emmler had died, to the far wall where the support beam now hung by splinters. Leo was not in a defensive position. He was inside a wound. The sounds of the tank began to diminish. The deep-throated diesel grumble receded, becoming a bass note felt more than heard, then a vibration in the stones, then a memory in the bones. The clanking of tracks grew fainter, replaced by the clearer, more immediate sounds of the infantry's withdrawal, the scuff of boots on rubble, a final burst of automatic fire, a distant whistle. Silence did not rush in to fill the void. It seeped. It was a different silence than before. Before, it had been tense, expectant, pregnant with the coming monster. Now it was hollow, exhausted, and vast. It was the silence after the earthquake, The ringing in Leo's ears, which had been a constant, high-pitched companion, now seemed to expand to fill this new emptiness. It was the sound of his own nervous system, shocked into permanent alert. He uncurled from his defensive ball. Every joint protested. He was caked in a second skin of gray-white dust, his uniform almost indistinguishable from the rubble around him. He pushed himself up to his hands and knees, then, shakily, to his feet. He stood in the center of the cellar, swaying slightly, a ghost in a ghost world. He looked at the breach. The world outside was a still life of destruction, but it was empty of the immediate, living threat. The monster was gone. Its attendants were gone. He was once again alone. But the aloneness was utterly transformed. He was not a defender left behind. He was a survivor left over. A strange, vertiginous feeling washed over him. It was the sensation of time restarting. For the duration of the tank's presence, time had been suspended, stretched taut on the frame of the impending decision. Now the frame was gone, and time flowed forward again, cold and indifferent. He became aware of mundane, brutal things. A fierce thirst clawed at his throat. The dull ache in his twisted ankle sharpened into a hot pulse of pain. The cold of the cellar, which he had ignored, now seeped into his core, making him shiver uncontrollably. He took a step, then another. He was drawn to the breach, to the source of the light and the departed terror. He moved past Emmler without looking. The old man's peace was now complete and separate. He reached the jagged opening, its edges sharp and warm from the recent passage of the colossus. He did not stick his head out. He simply stood in its frame, looking at the newly altered landscape. The tank's path was a topographical scar through the ruins. A wide, flattened road of pulverized brick, glistening with crushed stone and the dark, oily imprint of its tracks. It led away from the Reichstag, around a corner, into the smoke. He could still hear the faintest echo of its engine, a ghost sound on the wind. It was over. The confrontation, the standoff, the unbearable pressure, it had passed. He had neither fought nor fled. He had endured. He had absorbed its presence and let it go. A profound, almost nauseating fatigue settled into every cell of his body. It was the fatigue of a mental battle that had demanded more than any physical fight ever could. He turned his back on the opening, on the world outside. He looked at the cellar, his tomb, his chapel, his prison. His eyes went to the dark corner where he had consigned the Panzerfaust. It was invisible in the gloom, but he knew it was there, a dormant power, a rejected future. He did not go to it. He would never go to it again. Instead, he slowly sank back down to the floor, his back against the wall beside the breach. He drew his knees up, wrapped his arms around them, and rested his forehead on his arms. He did not sleep. He did not think. He simply existed, in the hollow, ringing silence, feeling the cold stone against his spine, the gritty dust on his skin, the slow, steady, undeniable beat of his own heart. The giant had exercised itself, and in its wake it left not a hero, not a martyr, but a boy, hollowed out and scoured clean, waiting for whatever came after the end. The silence was not peace. It was the echo of a great noise, and in its hollow space, the smaller sounds of the ending world rushed to fill the void. Leo became aware of them, one by one, as if his senses were slowly rebooting. The crackle of distant fires, a continuous, whispering backdrop, like dead leaves scattering, the occasional isolated gunshot, sharp, flat and final, somewhere in the labyrinth of ruins. And a new sound, the drizzle of fine debris still settling from the traumatized ceiling. A faint, perpetual hiss, like a leaking hourglass. Time was moving again, measured in the slow decay of a building and the beat of his own heart. He did not know how long he sat there, back against the wall, folded in on himself. The gray light from the breach did not change. It was the eternal, smoke-dimmed noon of a city's death. But a change was occurring within the cellar itself. With the monstrous, all-consuming focus of the tank removed, the space seemed to expand and contract at the same time. It felt both smaller, a pathetic ruined hole, and infinitely larger, a universe whose only inhabitant was him. A tremor began in his hands, a fine, vibrating shiver that had nothing to do with cold. It was the delayed shock of release, the nervous system discharging the stored lightning of the last hour. He looked at his hands, palms upturned in his lap. They were the hands of a stranger, filthy, cut, nails broken, skin etched with grime and the ghost grip of the Panzerfaust's trigger. They were not a soldier's hands. They were a survivor's hands. They were the hands that had held a letter about jam and cherry trees and had chosen that over a firing mechanism. The thought was not pride. It was a simple, stark fact. He needed to move. The inertia of survival was a trap. To stay here, in this frozen moment, was to become another permanent feature of the rubble, like Emaller. He had chosen life. Now he had to enact it, even if he had no idea what it meant. With a groan that was part pain, part effort, he pushed himself up. His body felt 100 years old. He stood wavering, and his eyes swept the cellar one final time. They lingered on Emaller, a calm, respectful nod to the man who had shared his cheese and his fate. He would not cover him. The war could have that much honesty. Then his gaze moved to the dark corner. The Panzerfaust was a vague, greenish shape in the deep shadow. It was part of this tomb. It belonged to the boy who had been told he was Germany's final argument. That boy was gone. He turned his back on it and faced the breach. Walking towards it was the hardest physical act of his life. Every step was a decision. Each one took him further from the false purpose of the cellar into the terrifying unknown purpose of what came next. The jagged opening was no longer a firing port. It was a threshold. He reached it. He placed his hands on the rough, warm edges of shattered brick and concrete. He took a deep, shuddering breath, filling his lungs with air that was no longer thick with cellar damp and death, but with the acrid, smoky wind of the open city. And then he climbed out. The world that met him was a vision from a fever dream. The grandeur of the Reichstag was a grotesque sculpture of ruin, its dome a shattered skeleton against the hellish sky. The street was a canyon of debris, unrecognizable, but it was also empty of immediate threats. The thunder of the IS-2 was gone, replaced by a pervasive, eerie quiet, broken only by the distant symphony of the city's death throes. He stood on the slope of rubble created by the tank's passage and his own shattered wall. He was exposed. He was visible. The feeling was utterly alien after the confined, defensive darkness. The sky, though stained, was vast. The wind touched his face. He looked down at himself. The Volkssturm uniform was a costume of absurdity now, a parody of authority and belonging. With slow, deliberate movements, he began to disassemble it. He unbuttoned the coarse, gray tunic, peeling it off his shoulders. He let it drop to the rubble, where it settled like a discarded skin. Underneath, his own shirt was damp and torn, but it was his. He knelt, and with fumbling fingers, undid the heavy military boots. He pulled them off, tossing them aside. His own socks were holed, his feet cold, but they were free. He stood again in his civilian trousers, his own shirt, his own vulnerable skin. He was no longer a soldier. He had stripped the fiction away. A movement caught his eye, back in the darkness of the cellar. The weak light from the breach glinted dully on a curved surface. The Panzerfaust. It lay where he had left it, a dormant serpent in its den. It was waiting for the next boy, the next old man, the next desperate fool who might believe its promise. Leo did not go back for it. He did not destroy it. He simply acknowledged its existence as part of the landscape of madness, and he turned away. He had to move. He could not stay here. He scanned the ruins. To the east, the sounds of battle, the Soviet advance, were a constant rolling thunder. To the west, there was a deeper, more uncertain quiet. That was the direction. Not towards anything. Away. He took a first step, then another, his bare feet tender on the cold, sharp rubble. He winced, but he did not stop. He picked his way down the slope, leaving the breach, the cellar, the uniform, and the weapon behind. He was a single, small figure moving through a gargantuan landscape of defeat. He did not look like a victor. He did not feel like one. He was not escaping. He was exiting. He reached what had once been a street and began to walk, his gait slow and pained but steady. The vast, terrible weight was gone. In its place was a hollow, aching lightness, a terrifying freedom. The arithmetic was simple now. It was not one boy, one Panzerfaust, one tank. It was one boy, one heartbeat, one step, and then another. He moved into the smoke towards the uncertain, uncharted territory of survival, leaving the last shot in Berlin unfired, and himself, finally, undefined.